Hello guys, welcome back. So this is the last video of our three-part video section for creating a secure and well-tested Django RESTful API. So in this last video, we're going to look at REST API unit testing, right? So what we're going to do is, if we navigate to the API folder, there's a test file that you see there. So let's start by deleting or removing this test file. Right, so I'm going to remove this test file. Then inside the API folder, just create a new folder called tests. So the reason why I'm creating a new folder is if I'm going to have multiple API or multiple API unit tests that I want to run, all the test files, I'm going to put them inside this test folder. So after you have done that, just go ahead and quickly create your new test file. So the test file is going to be called test_customer_API.py, right? So once I've created my test file, the next thing that you probably need to do is you need to actually go ahead and create your init file inside the test folder. So the reason why we're creating an init, so it's called __init__.py. So if you don't create this file, when the test runner runs, it will actually skip this file because it won't be recognized. So you need to initialize your test folder because this is a new folder. So once you have done that, right, let's go ahead and navigate to the newly created test file. So what we want to do here is we want to actually go ahead and write some unit testing on our endpoints, right? So if you go to the API URLs, you actually see that we have the customers and then the get customers by ID, right? So we want to write some unit testing on these views, right? So which means the customer view and the customer detail view, right? So in this case, I'm going to start by writing a unit testing for using simple test case, right? Because for our API unit testing, we're going to use the API test case, right? But in this case, I want to start by writing a simple Django unit test, right? So I'm going to use simple test case for that. So just quickly go ahead and write. So this unit test is simply going to test our URLs. So I'm going to call it API URLs tests, right? Then it's going to extend from simple test case, right? Like so, right? So I just want to start so that you guys, before I start writing the unit testing, you know where we're coming from and what we're trying to achieve, right? So the next thing that I probably need to do is I need to import my simple test case. So from Django .test import simple test case, right? So once I have that imported, right, so in this case, I simply want to test the URLs, right? For example, I want to test if this, for example, this customer URL is resolved, right? So how do I mean by that? So the unit testing that I'm going to write here, the Django unit testing, it is going to test whether this, if our client hits this URL API/customers / is supposed to resolve, or is supposed to actually go ahead and run or redirect to the customer view, right? So that's the test that I want to run, right? So for us to be able to do that, we need to import the reverse and the resolve function from Django URLs. So from Django.urls import, so we're going to import the reverse function, right, and then the resolve function. So what this reverse function does is it actually go ahead and give you an absolute URL. So what do I mean by that, right? So let me, so now that I have my class, right? The next thing that you need to do is you actually need to define your test case, right? So when the test runner runs, right, it actually looks for a file with the name that starts with tests, right, or a folder that starts with tests, right? So when the test runner runs, it actually see this folder called test, then it goes into this folder, then it looks for a file that starts with test, then it actually go ahead and run this file. Then while it's in this file, it will look for a test case that starts with test, right? So you have to note this, your function or the name of your test case has to start with test, right? So this test case, I'm going to call it get customers right, is resolved, right? So since inside the class we need to reference it with self, right? So let's now pinpoint our URL, right? So our URL is we need to reverse it, right? So the way we reverse the URL, because I said, like I mentioned earlier, the reverse function is used to get an absolute path, right, for URLs. So because here so if you go to our URLs, right, in our API URLs, you actually see that all the path that we've defined, we've given them a specific name, right? So for us to actually get the absolute path of these customers, for example, the absolute path will be /API/customers, then / at the end. So for us to be able to get the absolute URL of this path, we need to resolve it by its name, right? So this is a name customer, so we'll go to a test case, right? So we want to reverse the customer, right? So let's actually go ahead and do this. So what we are expecting, right, for example, if I actually go ahead and print this out, right, so that you guys will see, let's go ahead and print this out. If I print this out, right, and then I run my test case, we are supposed to get an absolute path for this customer. So let's test it out. So to actually run your unit testing, first of all, you need to make sure that your virtual environment is up. So I'm going to say pip env shell, right, in terminal, right? So this is just activating my virtual environment, right? Then I navigate to my folder, then I clear the terminal. So my virtual environment is now activated. So to run the unit testing, is simply say manage.py test, right? So if you hit this command, what the Django test runner do is it actually looks for every test file in all the apps that we have. So in this case, it actually looks for a test file in the API, in the secure, in the business, where's the business? Yeah, this one. In the business app, it will actually look for the API. But in this case, we don't want to test the business app, right? We simply want to test the API app only, right? So to do that, you need to provide the name of the app at the end. So in this case, we want to test the API app, right? So once you have done that, right, as you can see, actually it's now saying it is run one test, right, and then there are no errors, right? So you can actually see that at this line it has printed the absolute path, right, of our URL, right, this /API/customers. So this is how you get the URL, right? So after you've done this, right, our test is not yet complete, even though it's saying it is run one test, but our test is not complete, right? So to complete our test, we need to write some assertions, right? So basically the simple test case, it actually comes with the self dot we can use assert equals. So what assert means is we want to say, so it's more or less like a declarative statement where we are saying the URL that is being, right, so we later on need to resolve this URL, right? So if you resolve this URL, so let me go to the urls.py, right? So if we resolve this URL, right, we need to actually make sure that it's actually going to refer or reference a class or a view called customer view, which is a class, right? So how can we do that, right? So we can do that through resolve, right? So we want to declare that the resolved URL is going to be equal to the customer view as a class, right? So okay, so before I resolve, let me just start by printing the resolved URL so that you see what we mean, right? So if I print the resolved, right, I want to print the resolve, then I print the URL, right, then I save, then I run my tests, right? I want you to see, you guys to see what is being produced, right? So in the resolve, we can actually see that it has produced a resolver match, right? So inside this resolver match, you can actually see that we have something called a function, right? We have the arguments, we have the keyword arguments, we have the URL name, right, which is the name of the URL customer, right? And then we have the app names, we have the spaces, the root, right? So this is the absolute root, right? So what this resolve does, it actually resolves the path, right, and then gives you what things they're expected or what things are declared in that path. For example, the view name, right? So since everything is a function in Python, you can actually see that our class here, the view name is being referenced under the function parameter, right? So this is the function.api.views and then the class name. So we want to resolve if this class name, if this URL is going to run this customer view, right? So how do we do that? So to do that, we simply go ahead and write our assertion here, right? So for our assertion, we're simply going to say resolve, right? Resolve URL, right? Then, so we want to get the name of the class that is being, or the name of the view that is going to be run, right? So we'll get it by the function name, right? So if you type the function name, right, it will give us the actual class, right? It will actually it will give us the actual class, right? So for example, if I print this, so if I say resolve url.func, like so, it's supposed to give us, so let me comment this out a bit. It's supposed to actually give us the class name, right, of this URL. So as you can see, it's now saying function, then the customer view, and then the object of that class. You can actually see that it's now giving us the customer. So which means for our resolve, right, so I'm going back to my assertion, right, I'm going to say assertion dot func, right, for function, right, dot view underscore class. So this is how we get the name of the class. You say view underscore class like this, then dot comma, right? So what do you want to assert it? Want to assert that whatever the result function is going to be equal to, because we know that it's supposed to run the customer view. That's all. So we might need to import the customer view. So let's quickly go ahead and import the customer view. So from API dot views, right? So from the API app dot views, import customer view, like so, right? So like this. So we don't need this print function anymore, because you guys now know. So this is our session. So let's quickly go ahead and run our session. All right, so you can actually see that now the test has passed one test, right? And then there are no issues. So this is how you actually go ahead and write some unit testing, some Django unit testing for your URLs, right? So in this tutorial, we are not going to write some unit testing for everything for the Django. We're simply going to focus on the API unit testing. But if you guys want a video on how we can actually write some Django unit testing, whereby we'll be testing the models, the views, the URLs, and etc., you guys just let me know in the comments down below, so that I can actually go ahead and make a video for that. So in this case, this is how you write some URL unit testing in Django, right? So now let's quickly go ahead and move on to our main purpose of this video. So we want to write some unit testing for our API, right? So in this case, you have noticed that we've been using the API test case, right? So for the REST API, we use something called an API. We've been using a simple test case, but in this case, we now want to use a test case called API test case, right? So the API test case allows us to actually go ahead and write some unit testing for our REST API. So first of all, let's quickly go ahead and create the class. So the class that we now need to create, we can actually do it in this file. So it's going to be called customer API view, right? API view tests, right? This is the name. This is the name of my class, right? And then I'm going to extend from the API test, from the API test case. Okay, my typing is off today. All right, so we need to import this API test case, right? So how do we import it, right? So we're going to import it from the REST framework, right? So we're going to say from REST framework, right, dot test, right, import API tests case, right? So the API test case, it actually comes with an HTTP client called the API client, right? So here we don't need to actually explicitly define it, because there's something called an API client, right? Like this, API client, but this API test case class, it comes with this API client, right? Because for us to be able to write our requests, for example, the get request, the put, the delete request, we need to use an HTTP client. So in this case, we'll be using the API test case comes with this API client. So we don't need to explicitly bring it on, because we are going to use the one that comes with the API test case, right? So inside this test case, what do you want to do, right? So in this in the first, we need to actually go ahead and reverse our URL, right? So we're going to say customers, right? So the view, so this is for the first view, right? So we are simply we're going to write some unit testing for the customer view, then later on we'll write the unit testing for the customer detail view, right? So we're starting with the customer view, right? So inside the customer view, right, we have our URL called customers, right? Our URL is called /customers with a name called customer, right? So let's simply go ahead and bring it up. So we're going to say customer URLs is equals to, then we reverse to get the absolute path like what we did at the top here, then customer like this. So now that we have an absolute path, what do you want to do, right? So since this is an API unit testing, right, there are some couple of things that we need to do, right? So for example, you can actually note that the our endpoints, right? So if you go to the URLs, right, you can actually note that the customer view, if you go to the API views, you can actually note that the customer views, these customer views are secured, right? Which means we need to some way of providing a token or an authentication to our client request headers, right? So like I said, the API view comes with an API client, right? So when you write the request, we need to somehow to actually go ahead and provide an authorization header with a bearer token to our client, right? So that we'll be able to make the get requests or the post request specifically for this customer API view, right? So to do that, Django there's a function that you can actually go ahead and make use of called setup, right? So these are more or less like some context manager, right, which actually go ahead and manage the resources for us, right? So there's a function called setup, right? So what this setup does is everything that you want to set up. So like in this case, we're going to first of all, we need to create a user for our client, right? Once we have created a user, then after creating a user, then we need to create a token, right? A token. Then after creating a token, then we need to actually assign that token to our authorization header on our client, right? So first of all, we need to do that in the setup, right? Then there's a tear down, right? For example, like I said, these are context managers, right? We need to set up every time you run a test case or a test class, you need to set up and then tear down in terms of managing the resources, right? So in the setup, right? So before we write our test cases, we need to get this out of the way, right? So let's quickly go ahead and create the user. So we're going to use the user, right? The self.user is equals to user. So we need to bring in the user from the auth models, right? So let's quickly go ahead and do that. So we're going to say from Django.contrib, right, .auth.models import user, right? So after we have imported the user, the next thing that we need to do, like I said, we also need to create a token, right? So we need to bring the token from REST framework. So from REST framework, dot auth token dot models import, right? Import token, right? So after you have imported the token, we'll later on need to import the status. So I'm simply going to import everything that we're going to use in our test cases. So from REST framework, import status, right? Because we're going to use the status, for example, to assert that maybe if it is a 200 response or 201, we need to use the status so that we'll be able to make our sessions, right? Then after that, the last thing that maybe we probably need to import, I think I think this will do for now. So let's quickly go ahead and create our user. So to create our user, we simply say user.objects, right, .create user, right? Then we provide the username, right? So in this case, we're going to say maybe username is admin. Then we need to provide the password, right? Password, let's say some strong password, right? So now that we have created our user, what do you want to do, right? The next thing after creating a user, like what we're doing manually, we need to create a token, right? So let's create the token, right? So the token will be equal to, let's use the token class dot objects objects dot create, right? So in this case, we want to create a token by assigning so remember, when we created a token in the last time, we were actually providing some credentials so that it will be able, Django will be able to generate the token, right? So here we are simply providing the user that we've created so that it will be able to generate the token, right? So now that we have the token, what do we need to do next, right? So the next step will be actually to assign the token to our authorization header of our client, right? So in this case, like I said before, the API test case comes with an API client, right? So to use the API client, you simply say a self.client, right? So the user, the token, or all these are coming from the test case, right? So self.client, right? We are now using the API client, right? So self.client, right? So let's assign the authorization header. So you use a method called credentials, right? Then we assign http underscore authorization, right? Authorization. So remember, for our token, right, we need to provide the token, right? So remember, we use the token keyword for our REST token. Then we add the self.token that we've just generated. Then to get the actual string of the token, or you use the key, right? Dot key, like this, right? So this is our setup method, right? So after that, for context management, remember I said we also have a tear down, right? A tear down method, right? So in this case, I'm not going to use this tear down. The reason why, because is every time you write a unit test or you run a unit test, right, what Django does, if it's involving the database, it actually creates a volatile database, right? Which means when the database is created, after the test is completed, right, that database will be teared down automatically, right? So there's no need to actually go ahead and implement some tear down here, because that is being automatically done by our Django REST framework. Otherwise, if you're using other libraries, there will be need for actually managing the context using this tear down. So I'm not going to implement anything for now, right? So now let's write our test case, right? So for our test case, we're going to say we want to test if the get customer, if the get customers authenticated, right? So we want to test if we're actually able to run some get customers query, right, on our customer view, right? So let's do it. So now we need a response, right? So now let's write our request. So we need a response. So we're simply going to say response is equals to, now let's use the client to write the request. So we're going to say self.client. So in this case, our client already has the authorization headers and everything that we need, right? So we are going to say self.client, right? Then we want to write specifically a get request, right, for this one, right? So inside our get request, then we need to actually go ahead and pass the URL. So self.customer URLs. All right, like this. So it's not customer, let's say customer URL, right? Like this. right? So once you have done this, right, now that response, so now that our client has sent a get request to our URL, let's try to assert it, right? So self dot, we're going to use the method assert equal, right? Assert equal. So what do we want to assert? So we want to assert that the response, right, this is now get request, the response dot status, right, the status code that we're going to get is equal to the status dot http, right, http underscore 200 underscore okay, right? So this is what we are setting, right? So we're simply setting that this request is going to be successful. Why? Because we've provided some authorization headers, and we're going to create a 200 response. This is what we want to set. So let's quickly go ahead and save this and write and run our test, right? So manage.py test API like this. All right, so you can actually see that our test has worked, right? It has run 2 tests and both of them were successful. So this is the first one, and then this is the second one, and then the first one was on the URLs, right? So as a rule of thumb, remember, every time you write your unit tests, you need to actually go ahead and mess up with this. So let's say I say 401, right? So we need to actually see if our unit testing are working. So every time you need to actually go ahead and mess around with these assertions, so that we can actually see that it's behaving as expected, right? So you can actually see that we're now getting an error. It ran 2 tests, but 1 has failed, right? So the one that has failed, it's this one on our session. It's expecting 200, yet we've provided 401. Right? So which means our session is working. And also one thing, like I had mentioned earlier, we don't need the teardown. As you can see, it's actually at the beginning of the test, it has said creating a test database, right? So here it has created a test database, but after the test is run, it is now destroying the database, right? The database. So you don't need to implement a teardown, because everything will be automatically done for you, right? So for the get customer URL that was authenticated, this has worked, right? So the next test that we need to do is we need to test if we can actually do a get request for an authenticated authenticated this will definitely twist your tongue. Okay, an authenticated request, right? So for us, so remember, everything is being done in the tier. So which means every time we run our unit testing, the setup will set our authorization header with the token, right? But here now, since this method, or since this test class, test case is in this test class, how can you actually go ahead and remove this authorization header, right? So to remove it, right, not to worry, the REST framework comes with a method, right? So I'm going to use the client. So I'm going to say, first of all, I need to remove the authorization header. So I'm going to say self.client, right? It comes with a method called force, right? Force authentication, authenticate, right? Force authenticate like this, right? Then you simply go ahead and pass your user and assign your user to none, and then the token to none as well, right? Or either one of them, right? So if you set this to none, it actually means that we have removed the authorization header for specifically this function on our client, right? So now let's try to actually go ahead and run our unit test. So I'm simply going to copy these two, right? Because it's the same. I'm simply going to copy this and paste them here. But in this case now, the status code that we're expecting is no longer 200, right? So we are now expecting that we get a 401, which means we haven't provided some authentication. But for now, for the purpose of testing, I'm going to test it with a 200, right? And it's supposed to fail on this third test case. So let me clear my terminal and run the test again. All right, so you can actually see that it has run 3 tests, but 1 has failed, right? So which one? So it has failed this one, the assertion error. We were saying it's status 200, yet we have removed the authorization headers, supposed to be a 401, right? So in this case, our unit testing is working. So let's quickly go ahead and correct it to 401. All right. So once you've done that, it actually means that your client is now being saved, right? And then everything is working fine, right? So this was just for the get requests, right? So now let's quickly go ahead and implement the post requests, right? So let's quickly go ahead and test, right? Test posts underscore customer, right? Underscore customer, and then this one is going to be, we're going to provide is authenticated, right? Then we'll pass itself like so, right? So the first thing that we need is the data for our customer, right? So the data that we need the title. Okay, so for the data we need the title. Then for the title I'm going to say missed. Then the name, so this is just the name, right? So I'm going to say Peter. Then the last name, right? Going to say Parker. Then the gender, right? The gender, remember we had our status choice with the gender. Then the status, right? Remember for the status on our manager we had a status whether it was a draft or a published. So in this case I'm simply going to say published, right? So for the keyword it was small caps, right? So this is the data that we want to post, right? So now let's quickly go ahead and write our post request, right? So for our post request I'm simply going to say self.client, right? Then I'm simply going to say dot, in this case it's a post request, right? Then we assign the URL, so customer URL, then we assign the data, right? And then pairs maybe the format, so the format is going to be a JSON, right? So these are post requests, right? So after we have written our post requests, let's now write our sessions. So we need to say asset self.asset equal, right? So in this case we are expecting that since it's since this client is authenticated, we're expecting a status code of 201 is created, right? So status dot http underscore 201 underscore created, right? So these are the rest status, right? So this is the first assertion. So you can actually go ahead and write as many assertions as you want. There's no limit, right? So you can actually go ahead and say asset equal. So the more assertions the better, because your app will be more robust since you'd have maybe exhausted some more test cases, right? So if you write as many assertions as possible, it's actually recommended, right? So here I'm going to say the response dot data. So remember, each and every time you you make a post request, it actually returns the user that you have posted. So in this case I'm simply going to say the response is going to have a name called Peter, right? So I've written some 2 assertions. Let me go ahead and save this and clear my terminal and rerun the test. All right, so as you can see, it has run 4 tests and then all the tests has actually passed, right? So let's try to mess around maybe with the name here. Let's put John, right, and test it out. So put John and then we'll run our API testing again. All right, so it has 4 tests but 1 has failed, right? So it's Peter for John, right? So which means our session, our post request is working as expected, right? All right, so if our post requests is working, right? So the next one that we need to write is for unauthenticated, right? So I'm not going to write, so you guys, I'm going to simply leave this for you. For the unauthenticated, you guys, you can actually go ahead and make a pull request and write the unauthenticated. So just quickly go ahead, you can make a pull request and do that as your assignment. So the link in the link is in the description below for the actually for the repository, right? So the repository, it actually has a description, it has everything. I'll show you at the end of the video. All right, so by now I think this customer view, I think we are done with it, right? So let's move on to the next to the customer detail view, right? So let's write some unit testing for that one, right? So class customer detail API view tests, right? So remember, you need to extend your API test case for you to get all the nitty-gritties, right? So in this case now, right? So in this case now, what do you want to do, right? So if you go out to our views, right, we have a get request, right? So for our get requests, we have a get request, then we have a put request, and we have a delete, right? So in these two requests, we first initially need to actually pre-insert some data so that we'll be able to write some get requests. So we need to use both of the views, right? So if you go to the URLs, you can actually see that for our get request, the second one is actually taking an ID, right? Then the first one, it doesn't, right? But we need both of these URLs. Why? Because for us to be able to do some delete, some get requests, we need to actually pre-populate the table first, right? So what I'm simply going to do here is I'm simply going to paste the first one, right? The customer URLs, right? And then I paste it here, right? And then we need the second one, right? So the second one, I'm going to call it customer, because this is just for a single thing, customer. Instead of customers, I'm going to say customer URL, then I reverse the function. So for the reverse function of this one, it's actually it's called customer detail, right? That's the name of it, right? Customer detail. All right, so that's the name of it, customer detail, like this. But if I try to run this the test here, I actually have an error. Why? Because the error that I'll receive is the customer. If you go back to the URLs, this one is expecting a parameter, right? So which means for our reverse URL, we need a way to actually provide a parameter, right? So if I test this out, okay, so let me simply go ahead and clear my terminal and run so that you guys will see the error that we get. All right, so it's saying ran one test and one failed, right? So where is the failure, right? So the failure is saying for our URL pattern, the customer detail with no arguments not found. So which means we need a way to actually provide arguments to our URLs. So without arguments, it won't work. So we need to provide an argument. So let's quickly go ahead and provide arguments. So the way you provide argument, the reverse function comes with an args. Comes with an args. So the argument that we'll be expecting in this case is we need to provide an ID. So let's just provide an ID 1, right? So after you've provided the ID, right, we need to write your setup, right? So in this case, let me simply go ahead and copy the setup that we had before, right? So the setup that we're going to have is this one, right? So remember, we need to pre-populate the data, right? So inside our setup, I'm going to create the user, I'm going to create the token, then I'm going to assign the authorization token, right? And then maybe lastly, I need to pre-insert a user, right? So here I'm going to put a comment, saving user, like so, right? So once so the user that I want to save, right, I can copy the data here, right? So I can copy this data, right? So once I've copied this data, then I can make my post request, right? So let me simply go ahead and copy everything here, right? So I'm simply using the same data, like so. So we are using the customer URL that we brought in here so that we'll be able to make the post request, right? So maybe for the, so that you guys will see that it's different, let me actually go ahead and put a different I'm going to say Bruce banner like this, right? And it's published so that you guys will see the difference, so that you see that it's actually running two different classes. All right, so now after we have done that, the next thing that we probably need to do now is to actually go ahead and create our test cases, right? So the first test case that we need is we need to actually go ahead and test get customer authenticated, right? authenticated, then we need to provide a self like so. So for our test customer authenticated, we need a response, right? So let's write our request. So we're going to say self.client dot get, right? So in this case, we are now using the new URL, right? This one with an argument, because we want to get the customer by the ID. So we write that, right? So after we have made the get request, the next thing that we need to do is to provide our session. So I'm going to say asset, right? Asset equal, then response dot status underscore code, right? So for our status code, in this case, I'm going to say 200. Right, I'm going to say 200 because we're going to get the data, right? Then the second assertion, I'm going to say asset equal, right? Then response dot data, right? Dot data, then the name. So in this case, the name is going to be Bruce, right? Because we have posted a Bruce here, right? So the response is going to be 200, which means our get request is going to work. So let's quickly go ahead and run our test. So I'll clear this out, then I'll run the test. After we have run the tests, you can actually see that it has ran 5 tests and 1 test has failed, right? So where is the failure? Customer URL is not defined. All right, I forgot, since this one is an instance of a class, I need to refer it by the instance name, right? So I need to put self here. All right, so this was an instance variable, so my bad, guys, right? So let's rerun the test again. All right, so as you can see, it has run the 5 tests and all of them have passed, right? So this is how you do the get requests, right? So for the unauthenticated user, we can actually go ahead and do the same thing, but we are expecting to get a 401. So instead of typing this all out, I'm simply going to copy and paste this, and I'm going to say to change the name of our test case. So in this case, it's now unauthenticated. Then to provide some authentication, we need to use the force authenticate function, right? So let's use the force authenticate function to actually remove the user. Then we get, right? So in this case, we are not going to get a status 200 because this is an unauthenticated user. We're expecting to get a 401, right? So let's save this up and let's rerun the test. All right, so as you can see, it has run the 2 tests, right? So the last test that I'm going to run for this tutorial is I'm going to run the test delete customer, right, for the authenticated request, right? So for the, let's quickly go ahead and write our requests, our delete requests. So we use the delete method, then the self dot customer URL, right? So and let's quickly go ahead and write our session asset equal, right? So for the assertion, we're going to expect it to have a status code of 204, no content, right? So remember, when you write our delete requests, it actually returns a 204 status code, right? So http, all right, http underscore 204 underscore no content, right? Because after hitting the delete request, remember, it actually returns a 204, meaning it returns an empty object, right? So let's run the tests. All right, so I can actually see that it has ran 7 tests and all of them have passed. All right, so the last test for this one was the put request. So like I said, you guys can actually go ahead and do it. So if you have reached this far and if you have managed to make these requests, congratulations guys. This is how you do some API unit testing in Django REST framework. So this is how you actually go ahead and do that. So thank you guys for watching the video, and don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel just to support the channel. So I think I can actually go ahead and show you the GitHub for those who want to be making the pull requests. So the link for the GitHub is actually in the comment down below. Just go ahead and check it out in the description of the video. This is the link to the GitHub. So what I've done to the GitHub is I've actually written some sort of a documentation to this whole 3-part tutorial. So it's actually a long documentation where if you don't want to watch the video, you can actually go ahead and read it out. So just make sure that you visit it if you find it helpful. So it's actually a documentation with everything that you need to know about this whole 3-part video course. So naturally go ahead and you can style it, you can fork it, you can use it as you wish, but this is it. So you're actually free to make some pull requests to actually do those tests that way, so that it can be a contributor to this one. So this was it guys. Thank you for taking your time watching this video. I know that this was long. I'm looking forward to the next video. Cheers.